Firstly, what differentiates between Judaism and any other religion that ever existed in the history of this existence up to present time? In terms of what we call Torah Judaism, without a question, it's not a man-made religion, but rather it's a divine religion. Every Jew that existed 50 days after we left Egypt, to millions of Jews, they stood at Sinai, and each of them prophesied openly, and God spoke to every one of them. Every one of them heard the Ten Commandments. Everyone was exposed to the Creator, and the Creator opened heaven and earth to show nobody exists outside of Him. Every Jew witnessed this, internalized this, was touched, not in a physical sense. We could say maybe they were hyperventilating on this, but rather this was prophecy. Each Jew prophesied God directly connected to his soul. So the Rambam writes, and Ramchal writes, that when a prophet prophesizes, it's more absolute than seeing a person in reality. Because when you see a person in reality, it's your senses, what you're processing, what you're experiencing. When a person prophesizes, the prophecy is directly to the soul. It's not the body. As a result of that, there's no process. It's a direct connection to the soul. Every other religion, whatever religion you want to talk about, Lahavdil Elef Avdolos, there were a number of people who came upon or believed that this is a reality. It was based on their assessment, their understanding, the way they processed whatever that event was. But as the Rambam says, why is the basis for Judaism what we saw at Sinai? Not anything else, not the splitting of the sea, not the mun, not any miracle that took place. Because anything that's based on miracle, you could attribute to sorcery. That whoever, either the valuation or the one who actually brought it about, it's not God, but rather it's sorcery. Judaism is directly Hashem. Because every Jew prophesied and openly heard Moshe being chosen as God's spokesman. So we speak about the transmission of Sinai, where it begins with Moshe. That transmission is absolute truth, because Moshe is receiving the Torah at Sinai, was witnessed by every Jew, the millions of Jews that stood at Sinai, and witnessed this event. God directly communicating to Moshe in the presence of every one of them, and every one of them is processing it based within the context of prophecy. So where are we starting from? We're starting from a point which is absolute. It's truth on an absolute level. That truth on the absolute level was transmitted to Yoshua, to Joshua, who was there also. He was one of the millions of Jews who witnessed Moshe being chosen by God as a spokesman. Musara li Yeshua, Yeshua's Canaan, the elders. The elders were there also. It was a Canaan Nevi'im. And the elders to the prophets may have not been there, but they were prophets. They are the transmitters of the authentic, absolute truth, which was given by God to Moshe. And prophecy came to an end at the beginning of the Second Temple period. The last prophets were Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. They were the three last prophets. They transmitted this absolute truth to the men of the High Assembly. We've discussed in the past the obligation to pray, to say the Amidah. Is that a Torah obligation, or that's only a rabbinical obligation? It's based on the verse. We say in the second portion of the Shema, Ul'avdu b'chol levavchem, you should serve God with all your hearts. And the Talmud tells us, Ezu avodah shebelev, what is the service of the heart? Zu tefillah. That's tefillah, supplicating God. The question is that a true interpretation, or that's only a rabbinic interpretation? Rambam writes that is a true interpretation. Therefore, tefillah, to pray once a day, is a Torah obligation. Nachmanides, Ramban writes, no, it's only rabbinical. It's a rabbinical interpretation. But everybody agrees, even if it be a Torah obligation, it's only once a day. That we pray 3 times a day, what we call Ma'ariv, Shachris, Mincha, that's rabbinical. More than once a day is only rabbinical. Now, the text of the Amidah, who authored that text? On a Torah level, each person can pray in his own words. As long as you have the format, you introduce the Amidah with speaking about God's praises. Who is God? Then supplication, and closing with thanks. That is the format of Tefillah. The words that we have today, we have 19 blessings in the Amidah. And the words that we say were authored by the men of the High Assembly. Why? Now, what is God's language? God's language is Hebrew. Before the Jews went to exile to Babylon, the Jews spoke Hebrew, a pure language. It wasn't a jargon intermingled with other languages. When we had gone to Babylon, the Jews spoke Babylonian. The Jews spoke Persian. So even when they came back, although the language may have been Hebrew, but it was no longer that pure Hebrew. It was interspersed with other words which were from other languages. It's like Ladino. Sephardic Jews, they speak like the Ashkenazi Jews speak Yiddish, which is German. Jewish German, the Sephardic Jews being in Spain, there was a Jewish version of Spanish that was Ladino. But many of these words, even the Hebrew, they became interspersed in the Hebrew. The Hebrew was no longer the same Hebrew. And since God's language is Hebrew, the Anshe Knesset Gadol, the men of the High Assembly, chose the words and the text and the terminology to be used when we speak to God, because the individual could no longer speak that pure Hebrew. But the Hebrew we speak to God, which is the Amidah, that's God's language. So the Nevi'im, they had given over this responsibility to continue to transmit the absolute authentic will of God. That was given over to the men of the High Assembly, which existed. Mordechai, the story of Purim, he was one of the members of the men of the High Assembly. Nehemiah, Ezra, these people who came up from Babylon to rebuild the Second Temple, they were part of the men of the High Assembly. So they were responsible going forward, and that was the end of the prophetic age. There was no longer prophecy. Now, what was their dictum? What did they teach us? Hey, Mamru Shloshet Dvorim. We find that justice is fundamental to Judaism. If there's no justice, justice has to be truth. And the basis for justice is based upon the criteria that God sets what a judge must be, and what he's permitted to do, and what he's not permitted to do. For instance, a judge is not permitted to take bribery. A judge even does take bribery. Witnesses, evidence must be absolute. What's absolute evidence, which is admissible to court? The witness have to be interrogated. And you have to ask very specific questions. And if you don't ask those questions, the witnesses are not qualified to testify. That's not admissible evidence in court. All these criteria, which ultimately allow justice to be established, to come to truth, all these criteria were set by God in the Torah. The judge has to be of a certain caliber. He has to have certain credentials. The judge doesn't have those credentials. He's not qualified to adjudicate, and his verdict doesn't have any value. Why? Because since the signet of God is truth, justice has to be truth. And if it's not truth, which is set by God, the world cannot continue. Because God can only have relevance and a relationship with something which is truth. And if it's not truthful, God says, I have no relevance to that. Stom and Amora, which personified evil. And if you read about what their level of justice was, the guilty was innocent, the innocent was guilty. To that degree, they had a warped understanding of reality. And they justified things which, unless you're within their mindset, were not even to be considered. What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? It's not they were destroyed. It was a cosmic destruction. There's no trace of that existence any longer. But where did they fail? They failed. They were the antithesis of truth. As it says, Chatoim v'roim l'Hashem yo. They intentionally defied God. They're openly against God. Whatever God was, they were opposed to that. If that's the case, you cannot exist. Having mesuna bedin, you should be deliberate in judgment. Now the question is to meet the criteria. Even after you interrogate the witnesses, you have to deliberate. You have to reflect. As Rabbeinu Yonah writes in his commentary here, very often you ask a question, and the person is very knowledgeable who's asked the question, he responds. And very often, or even if he doesn't respond, you have a question and you have an approach. And when you reflect on it just slightly, you realize that the approach is flawed. It's not the right answer. And you reflect on it again and again. And you come to a point where you feel after you've reflected sufficiently, now you've finally come upon the understanding of what was difficult. You resolved your issue. Either you don't resolve it, but the initial first reaction or the first response very often is not correct. And anybody who is a person who has a certain degree of credibility within the intellectual field, he understands we're touched. It's a beginning of trying to understand. We have an approach. Then we realize it's not the approach at all. So being deliberate in justice, in judgment, is crucial to come to truth. Otherwise, you can't come to truth. Now, very often we say the law is that a person who has a conflict of interest is not qualified to testify. A person who has a conflict of interest is not qualified to be a judge, because that conflict of interest, it colors your understanding and you don't see correctly. There's an expression, a person has a great degree of objectivity. He's objective. Could anybody say that he's objective on an absolute level? He's absolutely objective. It's not possible. Why? Because every one of us is a sum total of all our experiences in life. Our parents, our education, our environment, our social setting, our peer group, our experiences in life. That's the basis for the way we see everything. Even if you study, being a human being naturally, because you weren't born with absolute clarity, we evolve through experiences and we develop and we mature. You could say a person is more objective. Despite conflicts, he's able to overcome many conflicts of interest. But ultimately, on an absolute level, because since we're all impressionable, we're all touched by many things outside of ourselves, to be objective on an absolute level is not possible. The only one who's objective on an absolute level is only God himself, because God is not affected. He affects. He's outside the realm of being affected. So we speak about truth. God is truthful. God has his signet is truth. That truth is truth on an absolute level. Although we want to be truthful and we believe we're truthful, but the fact is maybe because of that conflict of interest we have, or our orientation, whatever it may be, we haven't come upon truth, which is absolute. Therefore, when you sit in judgment, it's essential. Firstly, you have to have the qualification. You have to meet God's criteria. And even if everything's said and done, based on the verse in Psalms, Elkim Nitza B'das Kale, God convenes with the court. The court, if you meet all the criteria that God sets, you merit a divine intervention of God that he gives you that level of clarity. Otherwise, you can't come to truth. It's an impossibility. As I say, as objective as we want to be, we're always touched by our level of what? Of orientation or experience in life. Did you never know if you came upon truth? But one of the approaches, the prerequisites for God to intervene, to give you that divine assistance to come upon truth, you have to understand your shortcomings, and therefore you have to be deliberate in judgment. You reflect and you reflect and you reflect. And only after you reflect and you feel that you've come upon truth, then God allows you to see the shortcomings of your analysis and to come upon truth for what it is, but that's purely a gift of God. You know, there's an expression, it's known as Das Torah. A Torah sage has a certain level of understanding, and it emanates from his Torah knowledge. Doesn't mean say you're a Torah scholar. It's a combination of many things. It's based on his piety, it's based on his fear of God, and it's based on his knowledge. It's a total sum total of everything, and it's based on his belief and to what degree he fears God and reveres God, all that. That person, when he gives an opinion, that opinion emanates from his essence. And what's that person's essence? The essence is Torah. What is Torah? Torah is truth. But only because he represents truth, God gives him that level of clarity. So when he gives you his opinion, that's God's opinion. So I once told over a story not long ago, maybe a few months ago. I may have said it more than once, that there was a couple who were Yad Avram people. They live in Teaneck. And they were hosted by a family for lunch on Shabbos, observant family. And they said, and they had a few other couples there, and they said, you know, in ancient times, there was a concept known as Das Torah, that if you wanted to know what God's view is on issues, you went to a great Torah sage, and he would share it with you. But today, it doesn't exist any longer. As great as they are, it's clear it doesn't exist any longer. Torah sages don't merit any longer that divine clarity, the divine intervention to give them clarity. Why? Because here we find we had a Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered. And many of these communities went to the rabbi, the Torah sage, who was the leader of the community, and they consulted with him. Should we leave Europe or should we not leave Europe? And the rabbi advised them to stay, which was a mistake. This is the way they're saying it. Because ultimately, the communities that remained were all annihilated by the Nazis. Yimach Shemam Zichram. So you see clearly that as great as these people were, they didn't merit divine intervention, that clarity, because they told the communities to remain. So therefore, conclusively, today there's no longer what we call Das Torah. The Torah sage no longer merits that divine clarity that has relevance to truth. Now, why were 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis during World War II? Did God have anything to do with it? If you say God had nothing to do with it, then you have a conclusive proof that there's no longer divine intervention. But if you believe, which is the truth, that the reason why 6 million Jews were murdered because God allowed Hitler to do it, and for whatever reason, because the divine retribution decided we have to have that level of loss, that level of pain, to set the balance back in order. If you believe that, if the rabbis would have told their communities to leave, you know what that would have meant? There's no Holocaust. But God says we need a Holocaust. And God allowed it to be. Therefore, what is Das Torah? What does God say to the sage? What does he put in his mind? Exactly what he says. Don't leave. Because since there must be a Holocaust, don't leave. The rabbis didn't say to the communities, stay because you have to be murdered. They didn't say that. They said, according to our understanding, you should stay. Things will get better, whatever they say, doesn't make a difference. But that they did not give the right answer because God didn't want them to give the right answer. because it was meant to be that there should be a Holocaust. But again, but they were Torah sages. And Das Torah, this divine intervention has relevance even today, without a question. The famous story, with the Siamese twins in Philadelphia who had to be, they was connected at the brain that be separated. And the Surgeon General, when he read the article of Moshe Feinstein gave a ruling, and it was like a 3-page spread in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Moshe, being the Torah sage leading of the generation, he said he fasted for minimally a day, and he prayed to God to give him the clarity that his decision should be correct. What's this fasting all about? Either you know or you don't know, right? The answer is we're only human. As much as I know, maybe somehow I didn't come upon the truth. Maybe my halachic ruling is not correct. So he prayed for divine intervention that based on his understanding and his knowledge, which was unequaled at his time when he was alive, God should give him that clarity to give a correct ruling. And he gave the ruling. Koop, who was the Surgeon General, was amazed as a doctor at the level of clarity and the issues he took into account to give this ruling. He was overwhelmed. He's a Gentile. He's not Jewish. And here you have this rabbi who's one of a kind. There was a story, Rebbe Yoshev, it was his yard site yesterday, Rebbe Yoshev, passed away 7 years ago, passed away at the age of 104. Rebbe Yoshev was the leading Torah sage in his time. And he had, Alan would know as a cardiologist, he had a certain valve issue or whatever, a heart issue. And the only one who could operate on his particular issue was a leading surgeon from the Cleveland Clinic. He wasn't a Jew. And there was a certain person who flew him over with his team. He needed his own team, his own nurses with all the equipment, flew him to Israel, top area Rebbe Yoshev. The operation was a success. He gained 7 years because of this operation. You know what it means to have Rebbe Yoshev, the leading Torah sage, for another 7 years. He had 7 years added to his life because it was a success, the operation. But during the operation, Rebbe Yoshev was fully awake because the law is you're permitted to operate only if the chances you're going to survive. But if you're going on the operating table and you're not going to survive, you're not permitted to allow yourself to be operated on. So Rebbe Yoshev was fully awake the whole time, and he was allowed to ask the surgeon at certain points during the procedure, what are the chances at this moment? And the surgeon will respond. And he continued to interact with the surgeon till the end of the operation. The surgeon, who's a Gentile, was amazed. How could a man be the patient being operated on? And he was like a bystander, looking, observing, and asking questions. And he's actually being operated on. And he met him a number of times afterwards. He never met such a human being in his life. And he traveled around the country. The surgeon, a non-Jew, telling over experience the interaction with this great rabbi that he never met such a person in his life. The clarity and the tranquility and the control he had, and how there wasn't a detail that wasn't taken into account that had to meet certain criteria, otherwise he couldn't go further. It's having Besuna Bedin, because as a posek, as a decider, everything you take, you get involved in, the level of evaluation has to be the ultimate, the utmost level. And that's what they taught, having Besuna Bedin. It's not enough to be knowledgeable. It's not enough to have integrity. You have to recognize the shortcomings in a human being. We have certain blind spots. And the only way we have a chance even to address those blind spots, you have to be deliberate. You have to reflect and reflect and reflect. The Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin that if you ever had a capital crime case where the court would rule the death penalty, They would stay up the night before giving the verdict, and they would discuss it and reflect on it, and they would sit on it, and they would not give the verdict right after they take the head count. Who's innocent, who says innocent, guilty. They spent the whole night deliberating to make sure that their position was correct and cogent, and there was no other way to say it. Oh, then in the morning, they took account again. Guilty, innocent. And only then did they give the verdict. But until they're up a whole night actually deliberating and reflecting to make sure it was right, they did not give the ruling. And that's based upon this, having Mesuna Bedin. Because the only way a person has a chance to come upon truth and to merit the divine intervention to come upon truth is only if you take it with this level of seriousness. Because you should be deliberate in judgment. The second, Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. You should try to establish as many students as you can. What's the basis for Judaism? You have to have teachers to disseminate Torah. The Torah they disseminate, what has to be the quality of the Torah? If a person doesn't know how to process, I'll give you an example. A person goes to a medical school. Years ago, people couldn't get into medical schools in the United States. So during post-World War II, they would go to Switzerland. They would go to Italy, Bologna. There was a medical school. In the early 70s, they'd go to Guadalajara, Mexico. Allen, right? I'm not sure if the quality of the medical school in Guadalajara was the same as Einstein or University of Chicago was not. So the quality of the doctor that graduated from that kind of medical school, based on the professors that he had there, was not the caliber of the doctor that graduated from an American medical school. It's a different standard. It's like, today, people, when Russians came from Russia, they were doctors in Russia, and when they came to the United States, they became nurses. Because what you had to meet the boards of medicine in Russia, it was what you became a registered nurse in the United States. Very often. Wasn't that great. What's the basis for Judaism? It's understanding what the religion says. But what does the religion say? It's based on studying. How do you process it? So the experts who are the true mentors, they have to mentor students to be able to carry on the tradition. Even though they're not the people who are responsible for the tradition, but you need those qualified people, teachers, to be able to disseminate to the masses whatever the religion is. Therefore, it's essential that as many students as you could establish and mentor, you should mentor those students, because that's going to determine what the degree of dissemination and to what degree the masses are going to be impacted. Therefore, Midu Tamid Habeg. God forbid, people think, if there's a nuclear disaster, you have to store away food for the next 20 years. And you have to have a generator. Why? Because if you understand what's coming down the pike, if it's reality, you have to deal with that future, that possibility. The reality is, unless you have qualified teachers, religion comes to an end. Therefore, the experts, being experts and understanding what truth is, you should establish as many students as you can. As long as you teach and mentor, be a mentor. That's Hamidu Tamidim Harbe. Asusiog the Torah. You should make offense for Torah. Now, there are many, many laws which are rabbinic laws. The Torah tells us that you're not permitted to add to the Torah or detract from the Torah. Let's say we have 613 mitzvahs, commandments, 248 positive commands. Person says, you know something? If they're 248, I'd like to add a 249th. Torah says you're not permitted to do this. But we have endless rabbinic laws, which the rabbis added to the Torah. Why isn't that an open violation that you're adding to the Torah? Because if the Torah didn't establish those as laws, where did the rabbis have the right to add to the Torah if God himself did not communicate this at Sinai? The answer is, what's offense? Offense is only to assure that the law is not violated. You don't cross lines. And that's not called adding, that's called securing. You're securing the Torah. When you make offense, you secure what the Torah says. For instance, why you're not permitted to engage with muktzah on Shabbos? You're not permitted to touch money. You're not permitted to touch a tool that's used for building. Why? Because on Shabbos, a Jew is not permitted to transport from domain to domain, from private domain to public domain. So unless it's necessary to engage with that particular item, there's a concern that since all week we transport from domain to domain without even thinking, there's a chance you'll be in violation of transporting, which is a Torah violation. So unless it's something which is permitted to engage in with on Shabbos, as you say, let's keep it mean and lean. You have too much clutter, ultimately, you're going to cross lines. You can do the wrong thing. That's offense. So the guarantee that the Jew does not transport from domain to domain, they say only things which have relevance to Shabbos are you permitted to engage in. Something does not have relevance, you're not permitted to engage in. You're not permitted to kindle fire on Shabbos. So matches, you're not permitted to touch a match. Because what's the value of a match? You strike it to create fire. You're not permitted. Money, it's for what? For a commercial transaction. You're not permitted to do a commercial transaction on Shabbos. Therefore, money, you're not permitted to come in contact with money. But all these offenses to assure and secure the laws of the Torah that you should not be violated. So if the rabbis, that's the rabbi's domain, they already created the fences. So why are they saying here, Asus Torah, make fences? The answer is very simple. Every one of us have personal issues. I'll give you an example. It's known that if a person is not permitted to eat certain foods, good advice is don't bring it into the house. The moment you bring it in the house, you say, I won't eat it. There's no sin. Once it's there, you're creating temptation. Just bring it in the house. That's a personal offense. People, each of us, have certain weaknesses. We have certain Achilles heels. It has no relevance to the rabbis. The fences the rabbis legislated, that's across the board for all people. But each of us have our own issues that we know our weaknesses. And because we have our weaknesses, there, as a result of that, we have to create our own personal fences. And that's what we're talking about over here. Asir b'Torah. Nobody's perfect. Everybody has their own handicaps, their own weaknesses. Be honest with yourself. And because of those weaknesses, we have to take certain precautions. And because of that, we have to continually add to what the rabbis created to assure that we're doing the right thing. There's certain people, they have difficulty getting up in the morning. But that same person, he never in his life ever did not put on tefillin. Okay? And it's important when you daven in the morning, you should daven with a minyan in shul. But if this person has the tefillin at home and he sleeps late, it's almost not possible he's going to daven ever with a minyan except on Shabbos. So what does he do for himself? He has one pair of tefillin, he keeps it in shul. So if he keeps it in shul, he has no choice. He has to get up to make the minyan because otherwise he's not going to put on tefillin. So he's creating a setting for himself to assure that he should do the right thing. That's to do a positive. But each of us have our own issues. And how do we contend with those issues? To overcome certain barriers, or as we have to overcome that hump. We create settings to make sure that we don't cross lines, or we should do things, because if we don't, we're not going to do it. Because it's going to be too complicated to do it. because we have certain weaknesses. That's asusiyot l'Torah. Make a fence for yourself. There was a case many years ago. Person, he used to work for the Rothschild Bank. That was a financial genius, and he became a Baal Tshuva, going back 42, 43 years ago. And he's a man, he was into eating. And he loved game food. And there was a certain restaurant in Manhattan, they sold game food that you couldn't buy in a regular restaurant. And of course, it's not kosher species. And he was already doing well in all aspects of Shabbos. Dietary laws, he really had to continuously suppress himself because he was into game and he was a heavy-set person. He enjoyed the better things in life. And one day he couldn't control himself. And this person was a trustee in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. Yeah? He's walking down the street where this restaurant with game food, and he's about to go into the restaurant. You hear this? He already has his hand on the door. And all of a sudden he sees another trustee coming down the street. And the moment he saw this person coming down the street, he lost all desire to go into that restaurant. So how do you deal with it? You know, something, you don't walk down that block. Because if you're walking down that block, you're closer to the restaurant. Your hand is not far from that door. He shared the story with himself with me. It's only, otherwise he would have gone into, once he's in that restaurant, he's sitting down ordering whatever that non-kosher food is, that non-kosher species. And we're not talking about rattlesnake, you know, or whatever it is, or ostrich testicles. We're not talking about that kind of stuff. Okay? That's asusiyot l'Torah. We all know our weaknesses. We have to contend with them and be smart, take things into consideration, prevent problems. Majority of the time during the First Temple period, the Jews were idolaters. Very significant percentages were idolaters. Why? And it says at the beginning of the Second Temple period, the men of the High Assembly, they fasted 100 fasts and prayed that the evil inclination of idolatry should be destroyed. Why? Because the desire to do idolatry was more consuming than the sexual drive within a person. We can't even relate to this. The need to be subservient to a deity was all-consuming. Wasn't easy. They went and they destroyed that inclination, and therefore people were not drawn any longer to idolatry. The moment prophecy came to an end, the idolatry, the evil inclination of idolatry, because the only way you were able to contend with that desire, you had to have a direct connection from God, which is the prophet. But once the era of prophecy came to an end, idolatry had to come to an end, meaning that overwhelming, all-consuming desire. That's the reason. Yeshua was of such stature, all-consuming, holiness-wise, nothing could stand up against him. But once that dimension of person was no longer there, now who's contending for the leadership? Idolatry or the rabbis or the elders? Now it's a tug of war. With Yeshua, there's no tug of war. That's the understanding.
Yeah.